Imagine stepping into the Vatican, but instead of a holy sanctuary, you find a brothel. Presiding over it all is a teenage pope with dead eyes, who hosts orgies, toasts the devil, and castrates cardinals who displease him. The throne of God has become his personal playground of vice, and the holy city is choking on his sin. This isn't fiction. This is the story of Pope John XII, and you're about to witness just how deep the depravity can go. The air within the Lateran palace was a thick, suffocating thing, heavy with the cloying scents of spilled wine, human sweat, and cheap perfume. It clung to the tapestries and settled in the lungs like a shroud. Sunlight struggled to pierce the gloom of the shuttered windows, its weak rays lost in the twilight, catching only the glint of gilded furniture and the tarnished silver of feast-laden platters. Upon these platters, the remains of a bacchanal lay cooling in congealed fat. Scattered amongst them, and across the marble floors, were bodies. Limbs, pale and naked, were entangled with the rich purple robes of sleeping cardinals. It was a tableau of sacrilege, a blasphemous still life composed in the very heart of Christendom, a monument to a faith turned inside out. At the center of this profane masterpiece, slumped upon a throne upholstered in damask silk, was a boy. He could not have been 20 years of age, yet his eyes held the weariness of a millennium, a profound and unsettling emptiness. This was Pope John XII, the chosen successor to the throne of St. Peter, and this was his court, his holy residence now repurposed into a brothel. The sacred halls, once resonant with the solemn chants of prayer and the rustle of pious robes, now echoed with the fading ghosts of drunken laughter and the memory of animalistic moans. The very stones seemed to have absorbed the sin, sweating it back out into the stagnant air. Every shadow seemed to writhe with a life of its own, a testament to the debauchery the night had witnessed. The young pontiff's gaze swept across the room, but it registered nothing. He saw the sprawled forms of his clergy and courtesans not as people, but as objects, discarded playthings from a game that had finally grown tiresome. There was no flicker of remorse, no hint of disgust, only a vast, chilling indifference. His power was absolute, and this was its purest, most honest expression. A servant, moving with the practiced silence of one who fears waking a dangerous beast, began to navigate the human wreckage. He stepped carefully over a bishop whose snores rattled in his chest, his face slack and glistening with sweat. The servant's task was to clear the debris, to erase the evidence of the night before the city fully awoke, a futile gesture of order in a world surrendered to chaos. John watched the servant's timid progress, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips for a fleeting moment before vanishing. The fear in the man's eyes was more satisfying than any wine or woman. It was a confirmation of his dominion, a reminder that he was not merely a pope but a god in this fallen sanctuary, his whims the only law, his displeasure a sentence of death. He shifted on the throne, the fine silk rustling beneath him. His fingers, adorned with rings stripped from the papal treasury, idly traced the carvings on the armrest, scenes of saints and martyrs whose piety now seemed a bitter joke. The irony was lost on him, or perhaps he simply did not care. History, faith, tradition, they were all just more toys for him to break. The first true light of morning finally forced its way through a crack in the heavy drapes. It was not a gentle, cleansing dawn, but a harsh, accusatory beam that illuminated every detail of the squalor. It fell across a puddle of vomit near the altar, glinted off the edge of a dagger half hidden under a courtesan's hair, and lit the vacant, staring eyes of the boy on the throne. He did not flinch from the light. He met it with the same dead-eyed placidity with which he met everything else. The sun would rise, the city would stir, and the charade would continue. He was the vicar of Christ, the shepherd of a flock he despised. And as another day began in his city of sin, he felt nothing but the gnawing, insatiable boredom of a soul that had already consumed everything and found it all to be meaningless. The fear of God had long since evaporated from the 7 hills of Rome, replaced by the singular, capricious will of the boy pope. Divine law was a forgotten whisper, the only commandment that mattered was the whim of John, uttered in a moment and enforced with the finality of a headsman's axe. His rule was a festering sore on the heart of the world. Daylight hours were for the hunt. Not in the wild, untamed lands of nobles, but in the sacred groves and church estates, places consecrated for prayer and quiet contemplation. He would ride out with a retinue of sycophants and painted women, their boisterous calls and laughter a profane desecration of the hallowed silence. The hounds he unleashed were no more savage than the master who held their leashes. He hunted with a languid cruelty, a bored expertise that found no joy in the chase, only in the final, bloody moments of the kill. The deer that fell in those sacred woods seemed to die not of their wounds, but of the sheer sacrilege of their surroundings. When dusk fell, the hunt for blood was exchanged for a different kind of predation. The halls of the Lateran were transformed into a gambling den, where the dice, carved from the bones of saints, clattered across polished tables. Here, John would preside over games of chance that bled the church dry, one wager at a time. The stakes were never mere gold or silver. He gambled with holy patrimony, with estates and bishoprics, with chalices and crucifixes torn from the altars of Rome's most ancient basilicas. Each throw of the dice was a fresh wound inflicted upon the body of Christ, and the pontiff was the one holding the blade. He would call not on the saints for favor, but on the pagan gods of old Rome. His lips would form silent prayers to Venus for a winning hand or to Jupiter for a fortunate roll of the dice. It was a calculated apostasy, a deliberate turning away from the faith he was supposed to embody, a gesture of ultimate contempt. His opponents, trembling cardinals and terrified bishops, played with the cold sweat of damnation on their brows. They knew that to win was to invite his wrath, and to lose was to beggar their office and their souls. There was no escape, they were merely props in his nightly theater of avarice and impiety. During the feasts that punctuated these nights of sin, he would raise a golden chalice, filled not with the blood of the covenant, but with the finest Falernian wine. He would call for a toast, his voice carrying through the sudden, fearful silence of the hall. The toast was not to God, nor to any saint. He drank to the health of the devil. The words fell from his lips with a casual blasphemy that was more chilling than any crazed sermon. He would then let out a laugh, a sound devoid of all warmth or mirth. It was a dry, sharp sound that echoed off the marble, as cold and lifeless as the stone itself. To challenge this reign was to sign one's own death warrant, often in the most gruesome of fashions. His authority was absolute, and he tolerated no whisper of dissent. Any who dared to cross him, to remind him of his sacred duty or question his profane actions, were made into brutal examples for all to see. A cardinal subdeacon, a man who had voiced his disgust at the perversion of the palace, was the first to learn the price of piety. He was dragged before John, who listened to the accusations of his own sins with a placid, almost bored expression. He did not deny them. He simply passed sentence. The order was for castration. It was a punishment of profound humiliation, an act designed to strip a man of his very identity. It was carried out immediately, and the cardinal did not survive the mutilation. His death was a stark and silent warning that echoed through the terrified corridors of power. More terrible still was the fate of his own confessor, a man who had known John since he was a child. The priest, in the sanctity of confession, had dared to plead with the young pope to repent, to turn from his path of destruction. He spoke of hellfire and eternal damnation, his voice trembling with genuine concern. John's response was not anger, but a chilling, surgical cruelty. He believed the priest had seen too much, not just of his actions, but into the void of his soul. The punishment, therefore, must fit the crime. For the sin of seeing the truth, the confessor was to be deprived of his sight. He was blinded. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, suffocating under the weight of his sins. Rome, once the luminous center of the Christian world, the city of martyrs and the destination of pilgrims, now felt like a cursed and haunted place. The very air was thick with the stench of moral decay, a miasma rising from the Tiber. The people whispered in shuttered rooms, their prayers becoming desperate pleas for deliverance. They saw omens in the flight of birds and heard portents of doom in the tolling of church bells. Their shepherd was a wolf, and the flock was scattered and terrified, cowering in the shadow of his throne. He was the Antichrist wearing the papal tiara, a demon masquerading as the vicar of Christ. He had taken the most sacred office on earth and twisted it into his personal playground of vice and cruelty. The throne of St. Peter had become a monument to his depravity, and beneath it, the foundations of the world had begun to crack. The murmur of discontent was no longer confined to the shadowed alleys and shuttered homes of Rome. It grew from a whisper to a roar, a poisonous tide of rumor and testimony that washed over the Italian peninsula and began to seep across the formidable barrier of the Alps. It was a plague carried on the tongues of men. Pilgrims returning from the holy city spoke not of spiritual renewal, but of a profound and sickening disillusionment. Merchants carried tales of a papal court that resembled the lowest taverns of a port city. Exiled clergymen penned desperate letters, their script trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. These stories eventually found their way north, into the cold, clean air of the German lands, and to the ears of the king, Otto I. He was a man forged from a different metal than the debased currency of Rome. His piety was not a garment for public display but the very spine of his being, as rigid and unyielding as the iron of his sword. Otto was a warrior king, a man who saw the world through the stark lens of order and chaos, of divine right and sacrilegious usurpation. The tales from Rome were more than just unsettling gossip, they were an offense to his God, a stain upon the Christian world he felt divinely appointed to protect and lead. Yet, in a stroke of breathtaking irony, the call for intervention came not from the oppressed, but from the oppressor himself. John XII, for all his absolute power within the city walls, was politically besieged. Rival Roman families and the ambitious Berenger II of Italy gnawed at the edges of his temporal authority. The boy pope, a master of vice but a novice in statecraft, made a fatal miscalculation. He saw in the powerful German king not a moral arbiter or a potential judge, but a blunt instrument, a barbarian warlord he could summon to smash his local enemies and then dismiss with treasures and empty titles. He imagined he could control this northern force, using its strength for his own petty squabbles while keeping his own absolute autonomy over the Lateran and its pleasures. It was the desperate, arrogant gambit of a child who believes the entire world is a toy, and that all men can be bought or broken to his will. Thus, a message was dispatched from the heart of corruption to the court of stern piety. Pope John XII, successor to St. Peter, requested the aid of King Otto, offering the most glittering prize in all of Christendom in exchange for his military support, the imperial crown. For Otto, this was the hand of Providence. The appeal offered him the chance to fulfill two destinies at once, to restore order to Italy and to be consecrated by the Pope himself as the Holy Roman Emperor, the secular sword of a unified and purified Christendom. He accepted the summons without hesitation. His army moved south like a cleansing fire, a disciplined column of iron and faith descending upon a land grown soft and sick with decay. The soldiers, men of the cold northern forests, stared with contempt at the sun-drenched squalor of the Italian countryside, sensing the moral rot long before they saw the walls of Rome. Upon his arrival, Otto was met by a pontiff who performed the rites of welcome with a flawless, hollow grace. John saw before him a grim-faced warrior, old enough to be his grandfather, whose eyes did not reflect the awe of a pilgrim but the sharp, assessing gaze of a predator. The contrast between them was a chasm. The boy pope, draped in silks and jewels, was a picture of languid depravity. The German king, clad in mail and wool, was an icon of severe, righteous strength. They stood together before the gates of Rome, a living embodiment of the war being waged for the soul of the church itself. The coronation took place on the 2nd day of February in the year 962. The air inside St. Peter's Basilica was thick with the scent of incense and the heavier, unspoken weight of hypocrisy. The ceremony was a magnificent charade, a sacred pact between a saintly office and a devilish man. John moved through the solemn rituals with a bored, theatrical precision. He anointed the king, his hands, still bearing the faint scent of the previous night's perfumes, tracing holy symbols on Otto's brow. He then lifted the heavy gold crown of the empire, his slender arms straining under its weight. As he placed the crown upon Otto's head, their eyes met for a moment. In John's, there was nothing but a contemptuous void. In Otto's, there was the cold fire of a man accepting a sacred duty from a profoundly profane source. Otto swore his oath to be the protector of the Holy See, a promise that felt more like a threat. In the days that followed, the emperor was no longer a guest to be deceived by ceremony. He was a resident, and his discerning eyes saw everything. He witnessed the nightly bacchanals, the gambling away of holy relics, the casual cruelty that passed for governance in the papal palace. His initial shock hardened into a cold, implacable disgust. The pious warrior could not remain silent in the face of such abominations. He requested a private audience with the Pope, determined to confront the boy and recall him to his sacred duty. They met in a chamber far from the noise of the court, a space that for a few moments was cleared of sycophants and whores. Otto did not equivocate. His voice was low and stern, each word a hammer blow of judgment. He spoke of God's wrath, of the sanctity of the papal office, of the shame that had been brought upon the apostolic see. He urged John to cast off his worldly vanities and his life of sin, to repent before it was too late. John listened to this lecture with an expression of polite, unutterable boredom. He did not argue or defend himself. He simply waited for the old man to finish. To him, Otto's words were the meaningless drone of a forgotten language. This talk of sin and salvation was a tedious interruption to his pleasures. He saw the emperor's piety not as a virtue, but as a dull and brutish simplicity. He could not comprehend a power that was not rooted in fear, lust, or greed. With a dismissive wave of his hand and a few empty promises of reform, he ended the audience, his contempt for the emperor now undisguised. The meeting shattered the fragile illusion of their alliance. Otto left the chamber not with hope for reform, but with the grim certainty that the pontiff was a cancer that needed to be excised. He had seen the void in the boy's eyes and knew it could not be filled with faith or reason. For John, the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The men he had summoned as his attack dog now stood as his judge and jailer. The powerful German presence in Rome was no longer a shield but a cage, its bars forged from the emperor's unyielding righteousness. A new, unfamiliar emotion began to stir in him. It was fear. A cold, sharp fear of this man who could not be bought, seduced, or intimidated. But in the twisted crucible of John's soul, fear did not lead to caution or repentance. It quickly curdled, transmuting into something far more potent and familiar to his nature. It became a deep and venomous hatred. He began to loathe Otto with a silent, all-consuming passion. He hated his strength, his certainty, his faith. Most of all, he hated him for the silent judgment that was ever present in his gaze, a mirror that reflected John's own monstrousness back at him. This hidden animosity became the new animating force of his life. He smiled at the emperor in council, praised him in public declarations, and played the part of the grateful, reformed pontiff. But behind the mask, his mind was a nest of vipers, endlessly plotting the downfall of the men he had crowned. The last of the emperor's banners vanished over the northern hills, a final glint of disciplined steel and righteous faith receding from the corrupted heart of Rome. A collective sigh of relief, foul with the scent of stale wine, seemed to pass through the corridors of the Lateran. The long, tedious performance was finally over. For John, it was the feeling of a cage door swinging open. The stern, judging gaze of the German was gone, and the city was his playground once more. The brief, suffocating period of feigned piety had ended. The mask of the chastened pontiff, worn so poorly for weeks, was discarded like a soiled garment. That very night, the palace gates, which had been so quiet under Otto's watch, creaked open to release shadowy riders. They spurred their horses not towards monasteries or churches, but towards the fortresses of Otto's sworn enemies. Their pouches carried not blessings, but sealed letters of treason. He began to weave his intrigues with the clumsy, arrogant confidence of a spoiled child who has never faced true consequences. He dispatched envoys to the deposed Italian king, Berenger, the very man Otto had been summoned to defeat. He sent promises to the marauding Magyars, inviting them to raid the emperor's northern territories. There was no subtlety in his betrayal. It was a loud, public declaration of contempt, a gesture of defiance spat in the face of the men he had crowned. He wanted Otto to know, to feel the sting of his treachery. It was a personal vendetta, fueled by the deep-seated hatred he felt for the emperor's unyielding virtue. Word of this open conspiracy traveled north even faster than the emperor's own army had. The reports that reached Otto were not whispers of rumor but confirmed accounts of papal envoys in enemy camps. The betrayal was so blatant, so utterly without guile, that it could only be interpreted as a direct challenge to his authority and his faith. The emperor's reaction was not one of fiery rage, but of cold, hardened resolve. His hopes for the boy pope's reform, always fragile, now crumbled into dust. He had extended his hand in partnership and had been rewarded with the bite of a serpent. There would be no more warnings, no more counsels of advice. He turned his army around. The march back to Rome was not a procession, it was an invasion. The soldiers, who had been relieved to be leaving the sickness of the south, now returned with grim purpose. They were no longer the protectors of the Holy See, but its judges and executioners. The air before them crackled with the promise of a reckoning. In November of the year 963, Otto entered Rome not as a guest, but as a master. He did not go to the Lateran Palace. He went directly to the Basilica of St. Peter, the most sacred church in Christendom, and transformed it from a house of prayer into a court of law. He summoned a great synod, a council of all the bishops and cardinals who had not fled the city. The nave of the great church was a sea of anxious faces. The Roman clergy, pale and sweating in their fine robes, sat opposite the stern, bearded bishops who had accompanied Otto from the German lands. The emperor presided over the assembly not from a guest's chair, but from a throne placed directly before the main altar. His presence, silent and implacable, dominated the proceedings. He was the force of order in a world of chaos, the secular sword brought to bear on a spiritual cancer. A summons was sent to the Lateran, formally requesting the presence of Pope John XII to answer the charges laid against him. The charges were read aloud, the accuser's voice echoing in the cavernous space, each word an indictment that sullied the holy air. They were manifold and monstrous. He was accused of sacrilege, of toasting pagan gods and demons within the sacred palace. He was accused of murder, of the mutilation and killing of his own clergy. He was accused of perjury and simony, of selling the sacred offices of the church to the highest bidder without a thought for piety or merit. The list continued, a litany of depravity that shocked even those who thought they knew the depths of his sin. He was charged with adultery on a scale that defied belief, and of incest with his own kinswomen. He was accused of turning the house of God into a brothel, a gaming den, and a torture chamber. As the charges were read, a procession of witnesses was brought forward. Their faces were etched with fear, but the emperor's presence gave them the courage to speak. A priest with haunted eyes described the nightly orgies, his voice barely a whisper as he recounted the blasphemous rituals he had been forced to witness. A hardened soldier from the papal guard spoke of the men John had ordered killed or maimed for a moment of displeasure. A palace servant, his hands trembling, told of the gambling, of seeing the Pope wager the golden chalice from the altar of St. Peter on a single throw of the dice. Their stories painted a picture of a court so utterly debased that it ceased to resemble a human society. It was a descent into a pagan hell, presided over by a boy king who laughed at the ruin he had created. The testimony was overwhelming, a tidal wave of evidence that left the synod in stunned, horrified silence. And while these terrible truths were being laid bare in the heart of Christendom, the accused was nowhere to be found. John had received the emperor's summons, had read the list of his own sins with a flicker of amusement in his dead eyes. He saw the trial not as a threat, but as a tedious irrelevance. His response was not a legal defense or a plea for mercy. His response was to order his stable master to prepare his finest horse and his kennel master to unleash his favorite hounds. While the bishops of the world gathered to judge his soul, John XII had decided to go hunting. He rode out of the city at dawn, not with the furtive haste of a fugitive, but with the leisurely pace of a nobleman off for a day of sport. He headed for the distant mountains of Campania, their peaks sharp against the clear autumn sky. The crisp air and the promise of the chase were the only realities that mattered to him. His utter contempt for the synod was his final, most profound act of rebellion. By ignoring it, he denied its legitimacy, its power over him. In his mind, he was beyond their judgment, beyond the judgment of their God. He was a law unto himself, and his only church was the wilderness. Back in the basilica, his absence was taken for what it was, a confession. There was no need for further deliberation. The evidence was irrefutable, the guilt absolute. The bishops, under the unblinking gaze of the emperor, moved to their final, historic task. They declared Pope John XII a monster, a heretic, an apostate. They pronounced him unworthy of the holy office he had so thoroughly defiled. In absentia, they stripped him of his papal titles, of his priestly authority, of his very place within the community of Christ. He was deposed. The throne of St. Peter was now vacant. But Otto had already made his choice. A new pope was needed, one who would be loyal to the emperor and to the cause of reform. They elected a man named Leo, a respected but non-clerical member of the imperial court. He was hastily ordained and installed as Pope Leo VIII. So it was that while one pope was being consecrated amid the solemn chants and incense of St. Peter's, the other was miles away in the mountains, his laughter echoing through the valleys as his hounds cornered their desperate prey, oblivious and utterly indifferent to the fact that he no longer had a throne to return to. The emperor's new order was a house built on sand. Leo VIII, the pope chosen by Otto, was a man of quiet piety and administrative skill. But in the savage theater of Roman politics, these were not virtues, they were fatal weaknesses. He was a foreigner, a German puppet, and the city's ancient, prideful heart rejected him. He walked the halls of the Lateran like a ghost, his quiet prayers lost in the cavernous spaces that still seemed to echo with John's profane laughter. The Roman clergy offered him a thin, resentful obedience, their loyalty as fleeting as the shadow of the emperor's departing army. They despised John's sins, but they hated Otto's virtue more. As soon as the last of the German garrison had marched north, a new set of whispers began to snake through the city's alleys. They spoke not of reform, but of rebellion. They yearned for the return of their own monster, a tyrant born of their own corrupt soil, rather than a saint imposed upon them by a foreign king. John, lurking in the hills of Campania, heard these whispers on the wind. He was not a penitent in exile, he was a predator waiting for the hunter to leave the forest. He had spent his time not in prayer, but in forging new alliances, promising gold and power to any mercenary captain or disgruntled nobleman who would aid his return. His moment came in the cold month of February, in the year 964. He did not sneak back into Rome under the cover of darkness. He returned in a triumphant procession, at the head of a small, brutal army. The gates were thrown open for him not by force, but by the city's own treacherous invitation. The same crowds that had watched Otto's synod in fearful silence now lined the streets to cheer for the deposed pope. Their fickle loyalties had turned once more, and they welcomed their tyrant home. Leo VIII, the emperor's man, barely had time to gather his robes before fleeing for his life, his short, pious reign dissolving like a prayer in a whirlwind. John re-entered the Lateran palace not as a prodigal son, but as a wrathful god. The air, which had been cleared by Leo's brief tenure, once again grew thick and heavy. But this time, it was not the scent of wine and perfume that filled the halls. It was the sharp, metallic odor of impending bloodshed. His vengeance had arrived. It was swift, methodical, and unimaginably cruel. He did not seek to execute his enemies, he sought to unmake them, to turn them into living monuments of his fury. He wanted his revenge to be seen, to be heard in the lipless mouths of those who had spoken against him, to be felt in the fingerless hands of those who had signed his deposition. The first to be dragged before him was the cardinal who had testified with such pious horror at the synod. John sat upon his reclaimed throne, his face a placid mask of indifference as he listened to the man's pleas for mercy. Then, with a slight, almost lazy gesture, he gave the order. The cardinal's tongue was cut out. Next came a bishop who had been instrumental in Leo's election. For the crime of giving his blessing to the new pope, his right hand was severed. Another official, who had managed the papal finances under Leo, had the fingers of both hands amputated, one by one. His nose and ears were then sliced from his head. These were not secret executions carried out in a dungeon. They were public spectacles, rituals of terror designed to paralyze the city with fear. The mutilated men were not killed, they were cast back out into the streets, their horrific injuries a walking sermon on the price of betraying John XII. The city, which had so recently welcomed him back, was now plunged into a state of shock. The cheers died in their throats, replaced by a cold, stomach-churning dread. The brief, foolish hope that John might have been chastened by his exile was extinguished in a wave of calculated brutality. With his physical authority re-established upon a foundation of pure terror, John moved to reclaim his spiritual crown. He was not content to simply be the master of Rome, he needed to be its legitimate, unassailable pontiff. He would use the very laws of the church he had so long despised to sanctify his return to power. He convened his own synod in St. Peter's Basilica. The bishops and cardinals who assembled were not the stern-faced reformers of Otto's council. They were pale, trembling men, some of whom could still hear the screams of their mutilated colleagues. It was not a council, it was a gathering of hostages. There was no debate, no deliberation. A decree, already written by John's own hand, was brought forth. A bishop with trembling hands was forced to read it aloud, his voice cracking in the holy silence. The document declared that the synod convened by the emperor had been an illegal assembly, a violation of canon law. It pronounced John's deposition to be null and void, an act of sacrilege orchestrated by a secular tyrant. It systematically erased every act, every blessing, every decree issued by the men they now called the usurper, Leo VIII. It was as if the past few months had never happened, wiped from the official record by an act of sheer will. Then came the final, most audacious stroke. This assembly of terrified men, acting as the voice of the one true pope, formally excommunicated Leo. They cast him out from the body of the church, declaring him an enemy of God and man. John had turned the church's ultimate weapon back upon the emperor's own chosen representative. He had won. Utterly and completely. He had faced down the most powerful ruler in Christendom and had emerged victorious. He had crushed the enemies within his own city, not just defeating them but obliterating them. He sat once again upon the throne of St. Peter, his power now absolute and seemingly unchallengeable. The nightly feasts returned to the Lateran, more decadent and depraved than ever before. But now, a new energy infused the debauchery. It was the energy of triumph, the wild, ecstatic celebration of a man who believed he had proven himself stronger than any law, any king, any god. He was untouchable. Nothing, it seemed, could ever stop him. His victory was a pestilence. John was no longer just the Pope, he was the absolute, undisputed master of a city held captive by his terror. He had faced the emperor's steel and the church's law and had broken them both. His authority now rested not on a divine mandate, but on the fresh memory of severed tongues and fingers. The feasts in the Lateran returned, but their character had changed. The earlier debauches had been driven by a boy's hedonism, these new revels were fueled by a victor's hubris. Each toast was a mockery of the absent emperor, each profane act a celebration of his triumph over the forces of order and piety. But for a soul as empty as his, victory was just another sensation, and like all sensations, it began to fade. Having conquered every external enemy, he was left with the most implacable foe of all, his own profound and gnawing boredom. The old sins no longer thrilled him. He required sharper, more dangerous pleasures. So it was that on the night of the 14th of May, in the year 964, he grew tired of the gilded cage of his own palace. The laughter of his courtesans seemed hollow, the wine tasted of ash. He felt the familiar, restless craving for a different kind of transgression, something smaller, more intimate, and more real. He slipped out of the Lateran not as a pontiff, but as a common thrill-seeker, cloaked and unescorted. He moved through the darkened, fearful streets of his own city like a phantom, the very air parting before him. He was not escaping his power, he was merely seeking a more potent way to exercise it, to defile something private and personal. His destination was not a brothel or a tavern, but an unremarkable house on the city's outskirts. This was the true nature of his new hunt, not for power over cardinals, but for the base, simple conquest of another man's wife. It was the thrill of the mundane sin, of stealing something that belonged to a person of no consequence. Inside, in a room lit by a single, guttering candle, the act itself was as joyless and mechanical as all the others. It was a brief, animalistic coupling, devoid of passion, driven only by his insatiable need to consume and to spoil. It was in this moment, at the peak of this squalid, petty sin, that his end finally came for him. It was not a blade in the darkness or a drop of poison in his wine. It was a cataclysm from within. As one story was later told, a fire erupted behind his eyes, a searing pain that was not of this world. His own corrupted body, pushed to its absolute limit, had finally revolted. A great stroke seized him, and his reign ended in a silent, ignominious convulsion. The woman, tangled in the sheets beside the twitching body of the Vicar of Christ, could only stare in mute horror. There could be no screaming, no calling for the watch. There was only the sudden, cold reality of her own doom, trapped in a room with the most powerful and profane corpse in all of Christendom. But another story, a darker and more visceral tale, was whispered in the taverns and the marketplaces in the days that followed. This version spoke not of a failing body, but of a splintering door. It spoke of the sudden, enraged appearance of the woman's husband, his face a mask of primal fury at the ultimate violation. In this telling, there was no time for divine judgment. There was only the brutal, earthly justice of a wronged man. A brief, clumsy struggle in the candlelight, the sounds of tearing fabric and a single, strangled cry. It was not a battle, but the swift, violent dispatching of a pest caught in the act of its defilement. The end was a fall from a high window, a final, graceless flight through the night air. The body that had so recently been draped in silk and gold, that had sat upon the throne of St. Peter, landed with a sickening thud in the filth of the alley below. The husband's vengeance was complete, and he vanished back into the shadows from which he came. Whichever story held the truth, the result was the same. His body, broken and twisted, lay on the hard ground until the first gray light of dawn revealed it. The silks of his disguise were torn and stained with mud. The hands that had blessed emperors and ordered mutilations were clenched and cold in the morning dew. No priest was summoned to his side in his final moments. No prayer was whispered for his departing soul. There was no final unction, no viaticum to light his way into the darkness. He had excommunicated himself from grace long ago, and he died as he had lived, utterly and completely alone, without God and without forgiveness. The discovery sent a tremor of shock, not grief, through Rome. The monster was dead. But his death was as sordid and profane as his life had been. There was no martyrdom, no grand political assassination. He had simply been extinguished in the middle of a common, dirty sin, like a candle snuffed out in a brothel. He left behind no soaring cathedrals, no works of theology, no converts to the faith. His only legacy was the stain he had left upon the Holy See, a scar so deep it would never truly fade. He bequeathed to his successors a throne that had been irrevocably desecrated, a legend of monstrous depravity, and a world left wondering how the vessel of Christ could have been filled with so much darkness.